Good evening, dear listener, or good early morning, if you're the kind who drifts into sleep only after hearing about 9th century family tensions and ecclesiastical punishments. Tonight, we begin a slow, mildly uncomfortable walk through the dusty halls of medieval fatherhood, the kind where love was measured not in hugs, but in whether or not you were sent to a monastery for speaking out of turn. So if you're lying down, go ahead and let your blanket become your royal robe. Maybe picture yourself in a mildly drafty stone room. There's a tapestry, of course, one that's never been washed, but features a lovely griffin with questionable stitching. The wind is howling softly outside, and the candlelight flickers just enough to make your cousin's nose look like it's breathing independently. All is well. Let's begin. We begin as so many tales of disappointment do with Charlemagne. Now Charlemagne, whose name means Charles the Great, was not short on ambition. He ruled most of Western Europe by the early 800s and liked his sons almost as much as he liked consolidating the Carolingian Empire. The trouble was, he had many sons, and some were more curved than others. Specifically, one son named Pepin, also known to the unkind as Pepin the Hunchback. Pepin wasn't born in a castle. He wasn't even born in wedlock, which in medieval terms meant your future was already being quietly erased. His mother was Charlemagne's first partner, Himiltrud, whom the king dismissed politely by medieval standards, which is to say, without physical exile, just social one. Pepin stayed, more or less, but not proudly. From the earliest accounts, Pepin was raised as a possible heir, though more like a backup heir's practice dummy. He had noble tutors, a small army of retainers, and for a time even the vague glimmer of succession. That is until Charlemagne remarried, and then married again, and then a third time. Each time the new queen bore new sons, and each one was born straighter, healthier, and more politically convenient than poor Pepin. At some point, perhaps over tea, or during a particularly loud feast, Charlemagne made the executive decision to name his next son also Pepin. Yes, the same name. Pepin Jr. If you like, though medieval people didn't use junior unless referring to a smaller goat. This was less about sentiment and more about a kind of royal whiteout. He couldn't delete the first Pepin, but he could overwrite him with a shinier version. The older Pepin understandably began to sulk. He was raised in court, taught all the royal manners, forced to practice harp, while others were jousting. And yet, here he was, the discarded Pepin, the slightly bent one with no throne in his future, and a name that now belonged to someone else. Imagine being edited out of your own family tree while still attending family dinners. And so, like many eldest sons, throughout history, Pepin began to gather a few friends. And by friends, we mean disgruntled nobles, ambitious counts, and possibly a scribe with poor handwriting. In the year 792, when rain lasted longer than crops, and every horse had a name like Clatterhoof Pepin, and his quiet little club began to whisper. The plan was straightforward: depose Charlemagne, put Pepin on the throne, end the whole other Pepin confusion once and for all. Now what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in subtlety, or so they thought, because Charlemagne had something better than loyalty. He had people who owed him things, a lot of things, and most of them were good at listening. Before Pepin could even raise a sword or lift one with assistance, the plot was discovered. Charlemagne, to his credit, did not order a public execution, nor did he set Pepin on fire, which was still a legal option in some counties. No, he chose the path of monastic retirement, which sounds peaceful until you remember that medieval monasteries were mostly cold stone, weak broth, and 300 a.m. hymn practice. They shaved Pepin's head in the style of monks, which, if you're unfamiliar, leaves a bald spot in the middle and a ring of hair around the edge. Think friar, but sadder. He was given a robe, a prayer schedule, and a small cell in the monastery of Prüm. Not the worst punishment, to be sure, but also not a family vacation. And there Pepin stayed, not in glory, not in rebellion, but in quietly sanctioned exile. He lived out his days surrounded by ink parchment and bread that could also be used as masonry. As you rest your head and perhaps reconsider your own family grievances, remember Pepin, not the shiny one, but the forgotten original, the firstborn son who learned that in royal families, love is not guaranteed, and names can be reassigned like spoiled soup. In the next stage, we'll meet a father who made even less effort, one who, when offered just or suspicion, chose to throw his son into a well. But that's for later. For now, let your eyes close softly. Think of quiet abbeys, distant chanting, and the faint scent of musty scrolls. The world is quiet here. Pepin won't be needing the throne tonight. Sleep well, so we return, not far from the abbey, where poor Pepin sulked in sandals and murmured Latin prayers to a different time and a slightly different flavor of paternal disappointment. This time, we find ourselves among the creaking wooden beams and overly perfumed courtyards of the Burgundian kingdom, a place of noble intentions, questionable decision-making, and one particularly unfortunate well. The father in question tonight is King Sigismund of Burgundy, who, much like a baked onion, had many layers and caused occasional tears. Sigismund was, by all accounts, a competent ruler. He kept the borders tidy, dressed appropriately for public gatherings, and didn't lose too many wars. But when it came to fatherhood, let's just say he operated on the principle of assume the worst and then dig a well. Sigismund's son Sigeric was the child of his first wife, who had sadly passed away, or possibly been gently replaced, depending on which chronicle you consult. After some time, as was customary for medieval kings with political ambitions and drafty bedchambers, Sigismund remarried. His new queen, whose name is mostly lost to time, though she's often remembered as that stepmother, was not particularly fond of young Sigeric. Whether it was his tendency to speak plainly, or his unfortunate habit of existing near her at breakfast, she saw him as an obstacle. And like most obstacles in medieval times, the solution involved either exile, accusations of witchcraft, or a quiet drowning. Sigeric, for his part, was not especially rebellious. He didn't lead uprisings or throw stones at peasants. But he did make one crucial mistake. One evening, during what might have been a fairly ordinary feast, roasted boar, suspicious gravy, and a plate of turnips served 3 ways, Sigeric reportedly made a joke about his stepmother's dress. It was something along the lines of comparing her sleeves to a nobleman's bedsheet. Or perhaps it was the color. Accounts vary. What matters is that she heard it, she remembered it, and she knew just how to retell it. By the time the tale reached Sigismund's royal ears, it had transformed into a mutiny. Sigeric wasn't just sassing Satin. He was allegedly plotting to overthrow the throne, poison his father, and possibly redecorate the castle without permission. Now one might hope that a seasoned king would pause investigate, or at the very least ask his son if any of this was true. But Sigismund, like many medieval fathers, with a palace full of stress and a chronic mistrust of youth, chose instead to believe the worst. Perhaps he remembered a time when Sigeric refused to eat boiled leeks, or the way he once yawned during court. It didn't take much. The punishment came swiftly, and with the kind of morbid creativity that only medieval monarchs seemed to possess. Sigeric was brought to a remote estate far from the bustle of court life, and conveniently near a well. An old mossy structure that probably once served as a poetic symbol, but now simply waited to be misused. Sigismund, ever the solemn father, gave the order, and Sigeric, still clothed in the noble garments of a prince, was lowered into the well. Not with ceremony, not with even a vague effort at disguise, just a quiet splash, and the kind of finality only medieval justice could deliver. Some say Sigismund regretted it immediately, that he sat alone in the royal chapel for days, whispering prayers and staring too long at the stained glass depiction of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. Others say he slept soundly and felt mildly relieved the following week. Either way, history records that a son was lost and a well-gained a darker reputation. Now the irony, as it often is with fathers who act hastily, was that Sigismund's reign didn't last long after that. Within a year or so, he was overthrown, captured by a rival king, and eventually executed, though not by well. He met his end in less poetic fashion, possibly with chains, possibly with an axe, definitely with regret. And so Sigeric, the boy who mocked a sleeve and ended up at the bottom of a family misunderstanding, became yet another chapter in the long book of royal parenting, gone terribly sideways. His story echoed through the halls of lesser castles, whispered by servants who knew better than to joke during dinner. And somewhere, perhaps not far from the abbey, where Pepin once sighed over his cold soup, monks added another name to the list of those who had fathers with crowns, but not compassion. But we are not done, dear listener, because for every Pepin and Sigeric there is another tale, one involving family dinners, awkward inheritances, and royal men who couldn't resist meddling in their children's marital arrangements. And as the candlelight flickers softly against your bedroom wall, and the hum of the evening grows quieter still, we'll follow the thread to the next chamber of medieval fatherhood, a tale of a king who married his stepmother and a father who barely blinked. But that comes after. For now, let the image of a quiet well mossy and still rest softly in your mind. No need to peer too closely. Some stories are best viewed from the edge. If you've managed to keep your eyes open after 2 tales of sons discarded like wilted vegetables at a feast, you're doing rather well. But if your eyelids are beginning to feel heavy, that's perfectly fine. Tonight's 3rd chapter does not ask much of you. Just a little patience. Just enough stillness to imagine the clinking of goblets, the rustle of fur-trimmed robes, and the muffled cough of a bishop trying very hard not to comment on a scandalous wedding. Because here we are, still in the medieval swirl of fathers and their favorite mistakes. And tonight, we meet Ethelbald of Wessex, a name that sounds like someone accidentally sneezed while naming a child. Ethelbald was the son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex, a man whose parenting style could best be described as absent but ambitious. Ethelwulf was not a tyrant like Sigismund, nor was he the mildly regretful exile facilitator like Charlemagne. He was in many ways a perfectly serviceable medieval king. He fought his wars, he collected his taxes, and he did his best to look concerned during famines. He also, as was the royal fashion of the day, went on pilgrimage to Rome. A long journey filled with blessings, scrolls, and digestive distress. But before Ethelwulf departed for the holy city, he made a decision that would ignite years of uncomfortable silence around family tables. He entrusted his kingdom to his son, Ethelbald, which, in theory, was a sensible move. Ethelbald was old enough to manage affairs familiar with court rituals and capable of recognizing when a roast goose was undercooked. However, what Ethelwulf did not expect was that his son, having tasted the mild flavor of temporary authority, would develop a hunger for permanent power. And that hunger, dear listener, came with a side of deeply inappropriate romance. Because while Ethelwulf was away, possibly admiring Italian tapestries or struggling with Roman plumbing, Ethelbald decided that ruling Wessex wasn't quite enough. He wanted to secure his position, ensure loyalty, and perhaps prove he was more than just a regent with a very pronounced jawline. So he did what any medieval noble might do. In a moment of dynastic confusion, he married someone very close to the crown. Specifically, he married his father's wife. And no, that wasn't a metaphor. Her name was Judith, daughter of Charles the Bald of West Francia, and she had been Ethelwulf's young queen. By all accounts, Judith was beautiful, clever, and only slightly alarmed by her abrupt shift in marital status. When Ethelbald and Judith stood together at the altar, or whatever passed for one in a drafty Anglo-Saxon chapel, the air was thick with scandal. Clergy clutched their relics. Nobles looked away, then looked back, then looked away again. It wasn't just taboo. It was practically recreational heresy. The church did not approve. The chronicles groaned with moral outrage. Even the monks who usually only noticed feast days, and whether the beeswax candles were melting evenly, took time to scribble strongly worded notes. Ethelbald, for his part, seemed unbothered. He ruled as king. He smiled at public gatherings. He kissed his stepmother, now wife, on the cheek, in full view of peasants who would need generations of ale to forget it. But not everyone was so calm. Ethelwulf returned from Rome, sunburned and slightly holier, only to discover his throne occupied, and his wife, technically still his wife, wed to his son. There is no recorded speech from Ethelwulf on this matter, but one imagines he stood very still for a very long time. Perhaps he sighed. Perhaps he muttered a prayer. Perhaps he wondered if Rome had been worth the stomach cramps. In the end, to avoid civil war or a very awkward series of family dinners, Athelwulf ruled from Kent and left Athelbald to the rest of Wessex. A compromise of sorts. A father who relinquished his chair. A son who kept the crown and the queen. Their paths did not cross much after that. Historians disagree on whether Athelbald later repented, or if Judith quietly moved back to Francia with a collection of regretful jewelry. But the marriage didn't last long. Within a few years, Athelbald died unexpectedly, possibly of natural causes, possibly from embarrassment. Judith, now twice a queen and twice a widow, would go on to marry again, proving that in medieval Europe, nothing, not even marrying your father-in-law and then your stepson, could truly keep a woman down. And Ethelwulf, well, he outlived the scandal, if not the shame. His parenting legacy forever linked to one of history's most eyebrow-raising unions. The lesson here, if we need one before bedtime, is that medieval fathers often lost more than just affection when they left their sons in charge. They lost their wives, their titles, and sometimes the ability to look their bishops in the eye. And yet there's another story to be told. One about a daughter, this time, who didn't wait to be mistreated. She chose defiance. Sharp, sudden, and very nearly fatal defiance. Her name was Juliane. And unlike the sons we've met so far, she didn't get sent to a monastery or drowned in a well. She picked up a crossbow. But that's a tale for another hour. For now, let this moment settle quietly in your mind. A son, a crown, a stepmother, a marriage that no one toasted, and somewhere in the dim corridors of time, a priest quietly losing his patience. So here we are, gently descending further into the moody tapestry of medieval parenting, where family bonds were often stitched together with suspicion, inheritance, and the occasional weapon. If the tale of Ethelbald and Judith left a curious aftertaste, a blend of silk scandal and oaths said too close to the altar, then what comes next might awaken a different sort of unease. Not loud, not jarring, just the faint rustle of a crossbow string being drawn in the quiet of a chapel corridor. We've spent 3 stages with sons who rebelled, were disowned, or simply got confused about which queen belonged to which father. But now, let us turn toward a daughter, a noblewoman whose displeasure with her royal father wasn't confined to bitter glances or whispered gossip over venison stew. Her name was Juliane de Fontevraud, and she did what few daughters dared even to dream. She tried to assassinate her own father, King Henry of England, with a bolt to the chest and a steely look that could have curdled cream. To understand Juliane's story, you have to know a bit about her childhood, which, by medieval standards, was fairly ordinary, if you don't mind starting life as the illegitimate daughter of a king. Her mother, Ansfrida, was one of Henry's many companions of the moment, a title that meant lavish gifts, temporary affection, and a polite eviction once someone younger and better connected came along. Julian was acknowledged, raised with some nobility, and even married off reasonably well to a man named Eustace of Breteuil. Eustace wasn't the most exciting husband in the Norman territories, but he had land, and in the complex board game of Anglo-Norman politics, land was affection enough. Now, Henry, I like many royal fathers, had a very clear idea of how loyalty worked. You swore, fealty obeyed quietly, and if you happened to be related to him, even illegitimately, he might toss a castle or a hunting dog your way. But Henry was not generous with second chances, nor with sympathy, nor, as Julian would discover, with dowries. The spark that lit Julian's fury wasn't dramatic. It was as many dangerous things are about paperwork. Henry had promised certain properties. Let's call them mildly significant border towns to Julian and Eustace as part of their wedding arrangements. But when the time came to deliver those properties, stayed suspiciously under royal control. This wasn't an accident. Henry had the legal instincts of a tax lawyer and the temperament of a hawk. He didn't give away land unless he got something better in return. Naturally, Eustace and Julian protested. They wrote letters, summoned bishops, possibly sighed loudly in court. But Henry wasn't moved. Instead, he took hostages from their household. Yes, hostages, because in medieval diplomacy, nothing said, "Love you, daughter," like imprisoning your in-laws' children to ensure compliance. Among those hostages were Julian's own daughters. That, as they say in slightly more exciting histories, was a mistake. Julian was no passive noblewoman waiting for the wind to shift. She took this insult not as a challenge to her husband's pride, but as a direct assault on her bloodline. Somewhere in a tower overlooking a stormy keep or a chilly stone bedroom, thick with candle smoke, she decided that being a daughter was no longer enough. She would become an avenger, or at the very least, a serious inconvenience. The story varies by chronicle, but the clearest account places Julian at a castle in Normandy. Henry, unaware of the exact temperature of his daughter's fury, came to negotiate, or perhaps just glare at the walls. It was a standard royal visit, complete with armed escorts, minor complaints about the goose, and some attempt at diplomacy. Then Julian, dressed as a hostess, greeted him. And at some point during that strained embroidered encounter, she took up a crossbow. Not a polite warning, not a passive-aggressive note left near the throne. An actual crossbow, loaded, aimed, and released. The bolt missed, but only barely. It is said to have grazed Henry's chest, or perhaps his dignity. Either way, it was enough. Enough for Julian to flee the castle, enough for Henry to declare her an enemy of the crown, and enough for every nobleman nearby to pretend they hadn't seen anything. The days that followed were neither heroic nor swift. Julian and Eustace holed up in their remaining strongholds, clutching what little power they had, while Henry, likely nursing both a grudge and a bruised ego, ordered their capture. There were no grand battles, no sweeping charges, or poetic last stands, just a slow, grinding attrition of supplies alliances and patience. Eventually, Julian surrendered, not with chains or public humiliation, but with a quiet, bitter retreat. Henry pardoned her, of course, because kings often do when daughters stop aiming crossbows at them. But he never truly trusted her again. Julian lived out her days in relative obscurity, her name absent from most royal declarations, her children raised under careful watch. And yet, in that one moment, she stood as something rare, a medieval woman who rejected obedience not with tears, but with steel. Now, if your eyes are beginning to flutter, you may be wondering where this story fits within the greater quilt of parental failings. And the answer, softly whispered, is that Henry was not the worst of fathers, not by medieval standards. He didn't drown his children or exile them to a stone monastery. He merely ignored their claims, took their children hostage, and underestimated their patience, which, by 12th century standards, made him positively progressive. Still, our journey does not end here, because there is one more royal parent worth visiting. Before sleep fully takes you, a man who did not suffer a daughter's rebellion or a son's jealousy, but instead fell victim to a very mortal craving. A craving for dessert. And while this next tale lacks crossbows, it makes up for it with whipped cream and tragic digestion. The king, dear listener, ate himself to death. But let's not hurry. Let the bolts be still. Let the castles rest. And so we drift, not abruptly, but with the gentle momentum of a particularly full belly away from the sharp-edged tail of Julian and her well-aimed rebellion into a very different flavor of familial legacy. No crossbows here, no hostage negotiations or castle sieges, just a table set for excess, a crown resting slightly askew, and a royal appetite that refused to be modest. Tonight, our tale is soft around the edges and glazed with whipped cream, but it is no less tragic. We find ourselves in 18th century Sweden on a cold February evening in the year 1771, where King Adolf Frederick, ruler of the realm and frequent visitor to his own pantry, sat down to what would be his final dinner. Now, Adolf Frederick was not what one might call a memorable king. His reign was mostly peaceful, occasionally ceremonial, and largely directed by more assertive ministers. He signed papers, waved at the public, and tried not to trip over foreign policy. But if his governance was forgettable, his exit from the stage of history was anything but. You see where other monarchs were undone by assassination or battlefield missteps. Adolf Frederick succumbed to the far more democratic peril of overindulgence. His downfall, as recorded in the most oddly satisfying footnotes of European history, began with a feast. And not just any feast, a culinary procession that began with lobster and ended in legend. Let us imagine it together slowly with the clarity of a sleepy dream. The king, already dressed for dinner in layers of silk, and likely a velvet coat with embroidery no one dared comment on, was seated in his chamber. Outside, the wind may have sighed against frosted window panes, and a servant somewhere was probably regretting his life choices as he polished silver for the 5th time that day. The meal began with grandeur. Lobster delicately arranged on pewter plates, followed by caviar, rich, glistening, and served without irony. Next came the sauerkraut, pungent and confident, a northern nod to culinary identity. Then smoked herring, likely accompanied by the quiet clinking of royal cutlery, and perhaps the sound of a harpsichord being played too earnestly in a nearby hall. There was champagne, of course, not a glass nor two, but several. Toasts were made possibly to nothing in particular. One might imagine courtiers pretending to laugh at a joke the king barely finished. Yet none of these things killed him. The lobster, the fish, the effervescent wine all survived the evening unscathed by destiny. Now, what did Adolf Frederick in was dessert, specifically semla, a sweet roll that on paper sounds innocent enough. Made of cardamom-scented wheat dough, filled with almond paste, ground with whipped cream, and served floating in warm milk, the semla was meant to be a modest delight, a whisper of sweetness on a cold winter's night. But moderation was not invited to the table. The king, in a mood of celebration, or perhaps mild existential boredom, ate not 1, not 3, but 14 servings. Yes, 14. Semla, in quick and determined succession. Each one soft and inviting, each one just light enough to tempt another. Somewhere between roll number 10 and oblivion, someone must have hesitated a servant, a cousin, maybe the baker's apprentice, but no one spoke up. This was a king's appetite, after all. And if monarchs could command armies, surely they could conquer custard. By the end of the evening, the king reclined in his chair, victorious, but noticeably bloated. The air in the chamber was warm, heavy with dairy, and the scent of reckless festivity. He smiled, perhaps, or sighed, or loosened something that should have stayed buckled. A few hours later, the stomach cramps began. These were not the polite twinges of mild regret, nor the sleepy groans of a man who'd had 1 meatball too many. No, this was the unmistakable call of a digestive rebellion. The royal bowels, insulted beyond diplomacy, mounted their final protest. Servants were summoned. Tinctures were offered. Advice flowed like bad gravy. But nothing helped. And before morning, the king was gone. Official records listed the cause as digestive problems, which is the sort of understatement historians reserve for avoidable disasters. In truth, he had dined himself into legend proof that royalty, like pastry, is not immune to consequences. And while some kings are remembered for battles, or reforms, or tragedies etched in marble, Adolf Frederick is remembered for dessert, for Semla, for that slow march of cream-filled doom. Now one might assume that this tale ends here, or full and finished like a final course. But in the echo of that royal burp lies something more. Because Adolf Frederick was also a father. And his sons, particularly Gustav, who would become Gustav III, watched their father's fate with more than just filial grief. They saw the weight of indulgence, the fragility of sovereign dignity, and perhaps in some quiet way, a warning. Gustav would go on to rule with flair and ambition, to stage operas, reform laws, and eventually face his own dramatic end in a masquerade ball. But not yet. For now, he stood in the candlelight beside a table, still sticky with almond paste, watching the curtain fall on a reign that ended not with a sword, but a spoon. And just beyond that chamber, in the quiet corridors of the Swedish court, another tale was beginning to form. A tale of royal toilets, aneurysms, and a throne quite literally lost in the most inconvenient place imaginable. Because if Adolf Frederick was the king who died of desert, then George II of Britain was the one who died mid-necessity. But that, dear listener, is a story best unraveled slowly, like a ceremonial robe left too close to the fire. For now, we leave the table cleared, the semla gone, and the room thick with the faint scent of whipped cream and consequences. From the sugared silence of Adolf Frederick's final indulgence, we shuffle onward, not in haste, but with the measured steps of someone carefully navigating a very long hallway in royal slippers, trying not to slip on the polished marble while digesting a cautionary tale about cream. And as we turn the corner of history's quieter corridors, we arrive at yet another royal exit, one that did not involve feasts or family feuds or rebellion from ambitious offspring, but instead a far more personal moment. One so personal, in fact, that it's usually whispered about rather than written down. Tonight, we meet King George II of Great Britain, a monarch not particularly known for drama, revolution, or poetry, but who nonetheless managed to earn a rather unique place in the archives of unfortunate ends. While Adolf Frederick met his fate in the dining chamber, George's final bow came not with dessert, but in the most unceremonious room of all the royal privy. Now, before we go any further, it's important to set the scene properly. This is the mid-18th century, after all a time of powdered wigs, Baroque architecture, and deeply confusing etiquette. People bowed to teapots and curtsied to cats if they looked important enough. The king, by then, in his late 70s, had long since grown weary of court flattery and foreign politics, but he still maintained a certain routine. Every morning began the same way, a bit of mild conversation with footmen who pretended to enjoy it, a cup of something brewed too long, and then, without fail, a solitary visit to the royal water closet. Unlike the drafty garderobes of medieval castles, George's facilities were modern, for the time a chamber fitted with an elevated seat porcelain bowl, and the kind of luxury ventilation system that consisted mostly of a window someone had remembered to open. It was private, peaceful, and if you asked the servants, sacred. No one disturbed the king during his morning constitutional, which is why, on October 25th, 1760, when he failed to emerge at the usual time, alarm bells, figurative ones at first, began to echo down the palace halls. Minutes passed, more minutes, then hesitant knocking, then louder knocking. Eventually, someone summoned the courage, or perhaps lost a bet, and entered the room. And there he was, King George II slumped forward, head bowed, not in prayer, but in the kind of stillness that required no physician to interpret. He had suffered a sudden aortic aneurysm. His heart's largest artery simply gave out. It was quick, painless by most accounts, and thoroughly inconvenient. There was, of course, immediate panic. Doctors rushed in, though their tools were mostly decorative at that point. Courtiers paced. Maids wept decorously behind gloved hands. The official report used the usual solemn phrases. Sudden illness, natural causes, the kind of words one uses when the actual setting of death is less than majestic. Because, for all his titles, King of Great Britain, Elector of Hanover, Defender of the Faith, George II died on the toilet. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally and entirely on it. And while some chroniclers tried to soften the detail history, as it tends to do with stories like this, refused to forget. Of course, one could argue that it was a fitting end for a king who often felt at odds with his own court. George was known for his temper, his taste for war, and his general dislike of long-winded flattery. He rarely smiled in portraits. He frequently argued with his ministers. He distrusted philosophers and thought music was tolerable only if no one sang. And yet he was also a man of habit, of order, of precise daily rhythms. So perhaps it was inevitable that his final moment would occur, not in the heat of battle, not in the drama of statecraft, but in the quiet solitude of his preferred chair. The porcelain kind. The funeral, as you might expect, was significantly more dignified. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, placed in an ornate tomb beside his beloved wife, Caroline, with whom he'd had many long, silent arguments, and at least one shared sense of humor. No mention was made of the privy. The official eulogies spoke of stability, of peace, of legacy. But somewhere behind the thick velvet curtains among the lower-ranking courtiers and the gossip-prone kitchen staff, the story was told again and again, with varying degrees of detail and suppressed laughter. And perhaps in some small way it was comforting that even a king, with all his power and privilege, still faced the same fragile human truths. That in the end, it wasn't the crown that mattered most, but where one happened to be sitting. Yet the story does not pause here, not quite, because George II had children. And while they did not attempt to assassinate him like Julian, or marry his wife like Ethelbald, they carried forward his name and his fortune, and in at least one case, a peculiar mixture of ambition and theatrical flair. George III, his grandson, would ascend the throne soon after stepping into the role with vigor, determination, and an increase in struggle with his own mind. But that tale, strange and spiraling as it is, will have to wait. Instead, before we dive into the fog of madness and revolution, there's another tale waiting quietly just down the corridor. It is not a royal tale. There's no throne room, no privy, no cream-filled pastries. Instead, it is the quiet story of a man in jester's bells, forced to smile until his soul gave out, punished, not with exile or execution, but with expectation. Because in the next room, behind a painted mask, and beneath the laughter of nobles, waits the court fool. A father of none, a servant to all, and perhaps, in his own way, the most tragic family member of them all. Let your breath slow. Let the candles burn low. From the muted groan of George II's porcelain farewell, we now shift sideways, not upward, nor downward, just sideways, into a quieter, more echoing chamber of medieval discomfort. The royal privy has been left behind, the velvet curtains drawn, and now the air is filled not with scandal or scent, but with the clink of bells and the thin echo of forced laughter. It is the kind of laughter that does not warm the room. It flutters briefly like a moth with nowhere to land, and in its center stands the court jester, a man adorned with motley fabric and expectations whose very job description was to turn sorrow into spectacle, and whose failures, no matter how small, could cost him everything. The court jester was not born to comedy. He did not emerge from the womb juggling pears or reciting limericks about pigs. More often than not, he was chosen, selected rather, plucked from obscurity, because of a limp or a hunch or a voice that wavered between squeak and shriek. He was deemed interesting or irritating or unusually clever in ways that did not lend themselves to sainthood or military service. And someone usually a noble with too much wine and too little empathy would say, "He'll do. Bring him in." Thus began the life of the fool. You did not apply to be a jester. There were no auditions, no open calls or talent scouts wandering the villages, looking for men who could spin riddles while falling downstairs. You were often caught in a moment. Perhaps you made a noble laugh once by accident or panic, and that was enough. The next morning you found yourself in a castle corridor, being handed a cap with bells, a nickname you couldn't shake, and a new purpose to amuse the unamusable. And if you had a family, well, that became less relevant. Court jesters rarely brought wives or children with them. They became appendages of the throne fixtures of entertainment, somewhere between a lamp and a very talkative dog. Their jokes were expected, their presence demanded, and their personal feelings filed neatly away, usually beneath the floorboards, with the other things people didn't want to trip over. Life in the court was not luxurious for the fool. Yes, they lived indoors. Yes, they were technically fed. But their rooms were small, often somewhere near the kitchens, or tucked beside a storage alcove that still smelled faintly of onions. Their beds were straw. Their clothes were provided, and they were not flattering. The bells jingled with every movement, a constant reminder that they were never off duty. At dinner feasts, while nobles devoured roasted swan or puzzled their way through trenchers of eel pie, the jester would be called upon to perform. Not asked, called. A finger pointed in his direction, a clink of goblet on table, a demand, "Fool, make us laugh." And so he would. He would juggle poultry legs, tell crude parodies of current events, mock the bishop's haircut, imitate the queen's favorite dog, and when all else failed, pretend to trip over his own feet. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it worked too well, because the danger of the jester was that he was allowed to speak truth, but only until someone realized it was true. The cleverest jesters knew how to dance along the razor's edge, using satire like a feather rather than a blade. But even a feather, when dropped at the wrong moment, could trigger disaster. There are stories, many of them half-remembered in monasteries, and footnotes of jesters who crossed the line. A poorly timed remark about the duke's new mistress. A pun that too closely resembled treason. A song sung too loudly when the king was already frowning. 1 minute, you were the entertainment. The next, you were being escorted out. Sometimes, with your tongue still intact. Other times, not so much. And what of the jester, as a father, you might ask? It's hard to say. Most had no time for family, no place to bring them, no way to provide more than a fistful of stale jokes and a cot that smelled of broth. But some did. Quietly, carefully, they sent coin back to distant wives, kissed children in secret visits, and tried to explain that their job was necessary, if not respectable. They were not knights, nor merchants, nor priests. They were jesters, men who made kings smile, so they would not be hanged for failing to. There is one tale, soft in detail, but sharp in sorrow, of a jester who served a northern court for over 20 years. His name is lost, or perhaps never written, but he was known for his impressions. He could mimic the Lord's so well that one night, in jest, he impersonated the king's stutter at a wedding feast. The room exploded in laughter. Even the king chuckled briefly. But the next morning, the jester's room was empty. His bells found lying on the doorstep. No note, no trial. Just gone. His daughter, if the tales are to be believed, waited at a tavern 3 villages over, sitting on a stool too tall for her feet, and listening to the silence where a father's joke should have been. And so the fool remains eternally smiling in portraits forever nameless, in records always on the edge of applause and exile. His laughter, if it ever came, was never entirely his own. He served everyone. He belonged to no one. And yet, in his way, he was part of the strange fabric of medieval fatherhood, not through legacy or lineage, but through the quiet burden of pretending nothing hurt. Not even the laughter. But our story moves still. For beyond the walls of the great hall, past the cold stones of the jester's forgotten chamber, lies another kind of suffering. A forge aglow with heat and ash, where a different man bends steel, not into words, but into weapons. A blacksmith, a father, a figure of soot and silence. So we leave behind the weary jingle of the jester's bells, now faint and fading behind the wooden doors of the great hall, and step slowly into the thick, smoky stillness of the forge, where the laughter of nobles holds no power, and the only music is the rhythmic clang of iron against iron. This is no place for velvet or powdered wigs, no space for riddles or satire, just a dim, soot-blackened corner of the medieval world where heat rules and silence speaks in the form of sparks. The blacksmith, unlike the jester, was no entertainer. He was not called upon to amuse or perform. He was simply expected to endure, to lift a hammer, to breathe in the black dust of his craft until his lungs felt like bellows and his hands could no longer forget the shape of the tongs. He was a father in the most practical, almost incidental sense, a man who provided, not through wisdom or warmth, but through metal. The forge was his home, his chapel, his punishment. It was where he made nails for the castle gates, shoes for horses he'd never ride, and swords for boys too young to understand how sharp regret could be. In one such village, near a bend in the river, where the fish no longer leapt, and the water tasted faintly of iron, lived a smith named Alric. His name was common, his beard unkempt, and his eyebrows forever coated in a thin layer of ash, as though grief had settled there and never been brushed away. Alric had 3 sons, or at least he did once. One had been conscripted into a war no one remembered starting. Another had run off with a traveling baker's apprentice after declaring he would rather knead dough than bend iron. The third, the youngest, still lived at home, if you could call it that, a single room behind the forge, where the walls sweated in summer and groaned in winter. The boy's name was Owen. He was 14, quiet, with the wary posture of someone who had grown up flinching. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then usually with nods. His hands were already blackened with soot, his hair stiff with forge grease, and his dreams, if he had any, made no noise loud enough to interrupt the hiss of the bellows. Alric did not speak of feelings. He spoke of measurements, of degrees and pressure, of how iron must be heated until it forgets its shape before it can become something useful. He taught Owen how to grip the hammer without blistering and how to listen for the pitch of the anvil, how to step away exactly 1 second before the sparks kissed your skin. There were no bedtime stories, only instructions, always instructions. On Sundays, When the church bells rang in the distance and the other villagers bathed or argued about theology, Alric cleaned the forge. Not because he believed in God, but because rust was the only sin he couldn't abide. Owen would watch from the doorway, a rag in hand, unsure whether to offer help or stay out of reach. It was on one such Sunday that the nobleman arrived. A rider tall on a dappled mare, with a sword slung too casually across his back. He dismounted with the impatience of someone unused to being ignored and entered the forge without knocking. The air changed. Owen noticed at first the way the horses outside quieted the sudden stillness of the coals, as though even the fire recognized rank. The nobleman dropped a wrapped bundle on the work table. When Alric unwrapped it, his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. It was a sword broken clean at the hilt, its blade notched and weary. The nobleman said little, only that it was his father's blade once swung at a place called Falkbridge, and that he wanted it reforged, not repaired. Reforged, as if the past could be recast, its cracks erased by heat. Alric nodded once and gave a time and a price that made Owen blink. The nobleman grunted. The deal was done. But that night, Alric did not sleep. Owen could hear him pacing in the dark, his boots scraping the packed dirt, his breath uneven. The sword had stirred something, not memory exactly, but the kind of feeling men like Alric had long since hammered flat. For the next week, he worked in silence. Owen was allowed only to watch. No helping, no speaking, just observe. The metal was heated, folded, struck, cooled, and heated again. It was not efficient, it was not cost-effective, but it was personal. With each strike, Alric seemed to say something he'd never said aloud. I could not stop your brothers. I cannot teach you softness. I'm afraid, and I do not know how to show it. Owen didn't understand it then, not fully, but he stayed. He watched, and on the final night, as the sword cooled on a rack and the air smelled of completion, Alric turned to him and said, "Tomorrow you'll do the finish." It was the first time he'd ever offered Owen the final step, the polish, the edge, the pride. But morning never came quite right. Owen awoke to silence. The forge was cold, the door still shut. He found his father sitting near the coals, slumped forward, his hand still holding a file. Heart, most likely, or exhaustion, shaped like one. The sword sat beside him, gleaming faintly in the morning light, sharp and silent. Owen buried him alone in the small plot behind the forge, where weeds respected no man. The nobleman returned that afternoon. Owen gave him the sword, said nothing of the rest, and went back to cleaning the forge. He did not cry. Not then. But that night, when he picked up the hammer and struck the anvil once, just once, he understood that the sound could be both a goodbye and a beginning. And somewhere far beyond the river and the smell of iron, another fire burned, not a forge, but a torch held by a man in the shadows. A figure who dealt not in laughter nor labor, but in silence and secrets. A man who killed for kings and was forgotten by all. From the glowing forge, where Owen's hammer struck the anvil, like a farewell too heavy to carry, we now step into a colder space. Colder, not because of the weather, though the wind here does bite, but because of the absence of fire, warmth, and names. This is not a place where swords are made, but where they are used without ceremony. A place where footsteps are soft by necessity, and voices are kept in the throat like secrets that never make it to daylight. Tonight, We follow a man whose name you will not know. Even in the village where he was born, if such a place still exists, they do not speak it. Some say he once had a wife, or a child, or perhaps a brother, who looked like him in candlelight. But such stories are fog, and fog is no friend of certainty. What we do know, or rather what we believe based on scraps of parchment and the mutterings of retired guards, is that he was once an apprentice to a scribe. He wrote with a tidy hand, and he had a good memory for dates. That was before a certain scroll went missing, and someone ended up very dead, and suddenly he was no longer welcome near ink. Or perhaps that's the story he allowed to remain. He learned quickly that people preferred their assassins mysterious. He never corrected them. He took his first life in silence, with a knife borrowed from a kitchen in a manner that smelled of rotting pears. It was not graceful, it was not clean, but it was done, and it was enough. Word spread not openly, but in the way that such things do through glances, and half-coins slid under doors. Soon there were more jobs, each one darker than the last, less justified, more lucrative. A merchant who had borrowed too loudly, a cousin with too many opinions, a bishop who read the wrong passage on the wrong day. He didn't ask questions, not because he lacked curiosity, but because questions required answers, and answers made you slower. He learned to live light. No home, no pet, no one to ask where he was going or when he might return. He slept in stables, in cellars, in the hollow trunks of trees. When he slept, which wasn't often, and when he did, it was with one eye open, always. He couldn't remember the last time he'd dreamt. His tools were simple, a blade thin and darkened to avoid reflection, a rope knotted just so, a vial of something sharp-smelling that could silence a man in seconds, and a small folded scrap of cloth with a name on it delivered before each job. He never kept the names. He burned them after watching the letters curl into nothing. He didn't hate the people he killed, nor did he feel pity. They were to him like apples too high to reach now fallen. Their time was a matter of gravity. The closest he came to regret was once in a monastery when he mistook the wrong monk. That one looked up at him, eyes clear, and said, "I know." He never explained what he meant. The assassin left that job unfinished the first and only time. He heard later that the monk died of fever 2 weeks later. Perhaps the universe had its own timing. He wondered about that briefly. Then he moved on. Over time, the work became harder, not because the jobs grew more difficult, but because the weight of being unseen began to press into him. People looked through him. Even in taverns, when he paid for ale with honest coin, no one remembered his face. He could have been anyone. He often was. Once in the dead of winter, he took refuge in a hunter's cabin high in the hills. There was no job, just exhaustion. He found bread hard as stone and a blanket that smelled of pine. The hunter returned before dawn and saw him, but said nothing. They sat across from each other, the fire crackling. No questions, no lies, just two men sharing heat in a world that rarely offered it. In the morning, he left a coin on the table and was gone before the frost melted. He never forgot that night. It was the closest thing to kindness he'd had in years. Then came the job he didn't expect. The name on the cloth was familiar. Too familiar. A nobleman he'd once worked for. The man who had trained him in a way not in killing, but in obedience. The kind of man who gave orders with honeyed words and punishment with a smile. The message was clear. Clean up what you helped create. There was no choice. He made the journey slowly, deliberately. When he arrived, the manor was quite snow, gathering on the windowsills. He found the man in his study, older now, but still full of the same casual cruelty. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The job was done quickly, but not without effort. Afterward, he sat in the study for a long time, staring at the books on the shelf. Most had never been opened. He wondered if that was how people saw him, useful bound, but never really read. That night, he didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of the silence inside his chest. Something had shifted. Perhaps the work had ended. Perhaps he had become the final name on his own list. He wandered then, north into colder lands where no one had jobs to offer, and even fewer reasons to care. His hands, once so steady, began to tremble, not with age, but with memory. He tried to forget. He tried to forgive. He failed at both. But in the darkness of those northern nights, under skies heavy with snow and silence, he found something unexpected. A group of pilgrims traveling on foot, bound for a monastery older than maps. They offered him bread. They asked no questions. And for the first time in years, he said his name aloud. It felt like dust in his mouth, but they didn't laugh. They simply nodded. He walked with them, not as a killer, not as a ghost, just as a man, quite tired, walking. And perhaps somewhere beyond those snowy hills, something else waited. Not a mission, not redemption, but a cup of warm broth and a bed that did not smell of blood, but that, like all gentle things, was still just beyond reach, because not far from the path of those pilgrims, behind a crooked wooden door, in a village where no one had teeth, and everyone had stories, a new tale was being told, a story of a peasant woman, thick with blankets, staring down another impossible winter, from the hush of footsteps fading in snow, where the assassin's blade no longer whispered, and pilgrims shared warmth without suspicion. We now follow a crooked path down toward a village that the maps no longer bothered to name. It sat at the edge of a forgotten valley where the wind always sounded, like someone saying, "Hurry," and yet nothing ever did. Here, houses leaned against each other, like tired old friends. Roofs sagged under the weight of too many winters, and chimneys puffed smoke so thin it looked embarrassed. Among these humble shapes lived a woman named Marga, though few ever called her that anymore. To most, she was old Marga, or sometimes simply the widow with the soup. No one could say exactly how old she was, and no one dared ask. She measured time not in years, but in how many snowfalls had passed since the roof last leaked, how many times the goats had stopped giving milk too early, and how many spoons of dried thyme still clung to the bottom of her kitchen jar. Marga had lived in that same drafty house for so long that the floorboards knew her footsteps and creaked only when unfamiliar boots arrived. Her husband had once been a thatcher, a man with strong hands and few words who had died 20 winters back, after slipping from a roof he insisted was fine. Her children, 3 in total, had grown up and scattered like startled hens, one to the city, one to a war that no one won, and one who married a tanner and moved 2 valleys over, sending the occasional letter, and once famously a goose feather that Marga kept on her windowsill for reasons even she didn't quite understand. Life for Marga was not tragic, nor was it heroic. It simply was. Every morning, she lit her stove with fingers that remembered fire better than touch, boiled water from the well that tasted of pebbles, and sorted through her cupboard of dried things. Roots leaves small hopes in dusty jars. Her days followed a slow, familiar rhythm. Stir the pot, mend the socks, scold the chickens, and then sit near the window with a cup of something vaguely warm, watching the snow fall and not thinking too hard. But winters had grown longer, or perhaps her bones had grown less patient. Either way, warmth came late and left early, and firewood disappeared faster than stories. She rationed everything: salt flour, cheerful thoughts. Even the dog, a mutt with one ear, and the dignified name of Bishop, seemed to sigh more often. Still, Marga endured. That was her great skill. She did not flourish or thrive or triumph. She endured. She patched the holes in her shawl with thread pulled from old curtains. She brewed soup from cabbage stems and yesterday's thoughts. And when neighbors knocked, usually at dusk, hats in hand and stomachs echoing, she always had a bowl ready. Thin, yes, but warm. She never asked questions, and they never asked how she managed. But she did, somehow. One particularly bitter evening, when the snow outside looked more like flour tossed by an angry baker, a knock came that was not like the others. It was firm, almost rhythmic, and when she opened the door, the man standing there was wrapped in layers. Not common to this village, faded wool, a satchel slung low, and eyes that didn't flinch in the cold. He looked neither noble nor poor, just worn, like a boot that had walked too many roads. "Soup?" he asked, voice low, almost apologetic. Marga squinted, nodded, and stepped aside. He entered without a word, sat where everyone did, and accepted the bowl without complaint. Bishop sniffed him once, and then lay back down, which was Marga's way of knowing a man wasn't trouble. They didn't talk. He ate slowly, carefully, like someone remembering how. After a while, she refilled his bowl without asking. Later still, she placed a second log on the fire. When he stood to leave, he pulled something from his satchel, a small pouch of dried apples, a gift from farther south. He placed it gently on her shelf. No words, just a nod. Then he was gone. Footsteps swallowed by the snow. She watched him go not with curiosity, but with something closer to understanding, the kind that passes between people who no longer need explanations. That night, she added the apples to her stew and found the broth sweeter than expected. In the days that followed, the village quieted. Winter deepened. But something in the rhythm had shifted. Marga, who once counted time and how many spoons she needed to stir a pot, now found herself pausing, listening. She thought sometimes of the man with the satchel, not as a story, but as a reminder that even in winters like this, someone might still knock. And perhaps in some future snowfall, she might offer not just soup, but a place to stay. Yet for now, she stirred, mended, endured. The wind still called hurry, but Marga only answered when it was time. And beyond the village, beyond the valley, in the heart of a grand hall long since emptied of nobility, another kind of hunger stirred not for soup, but for song. Because just as the peasant woman counted winters, there once were monks who counted hours in psalms, and they too had a tale of sleep silence and the strange hours when people dreamed of God and grumbled about blankets. So we leave behind Marga's crumbling hearth, where soup simmered in silence and the wind muttered beneath the eaves, and we move not far in distance, but quite a ways in tone. Up a narrow hill, just beyond the tree line, where the snow falls straighter, and the stars appear like watchful eyes, sits the abbey of St. Mellitus, a stone structure so old the moss had stopped trying to grow on it. It had been there for centuries, its stones laid by hands long forgotten, its purpose unchanged. It was a place of prayer, and more importantly, a place of strict scheduling. The monks of St. Mellitus, wrapped in woolen robes and weary from years of disciplined humility, divided their lives into hours of a divine service. They were not rebels, nor adventurers, nor even particularly curious. Their entire world fit neatly between chapel and cloister, between the cold stone basin for washing and the wooden benches that squeaked in confession. But what the scriptures didn't prepare them for what even the oldest among them mumbled about only in private was the hour between matins and lauds. The third hour. Not the canonical third hour, which technically arrived mid-morning, but the secret third hour. The one that came just before dawn, when the candles burned unevenly, and the silence inside the abbey grew thicker than the snow outside. It was then that the monks did not speak, not even in whispers. It was the hour when the warmth of their straw mattresses had been forsaken for cold stone pews, when prayer felt more like waiting, and sleep pulled at their eyes like a sin. Brother Anselm, who had not missed a single prayer bell in 41 years, called it the hour of slow thoughts. He often nodded off during Psalms 51 through 54, catching himself only when his forehead knocked gently against the hymn-board. Brother Cadric referred to it as the time when bread thinks it's a pillow. And he often came to chapel with crumbs tucked into his sleeves. Then there was Brother Timon, the youngest, who simply feared it. Not because he lacked devotion, but because in those pre-dawn shadows, even faith began to flicker. The third hour, you see, was when dreams lingered. Not the grand, meaningful visions sent by saints, but the half-dreams, the ones filled with forgotten faces, misplaced sandals, and the sound of bells that never rang. And in that hour, every stone in the abbey seemed to creak louder. Every candle seemed to sputter at a wrong moment, and the wind outside, always the wind, scratched at the shutters, like a question no one wanted to answer. But still, they rose. Every night, without fail, the bell would toll low and slow, as if even it wished to be asleep, and the monks would shuffle from their cots, slipping into robes stiff with cold and resolve. They would light the lamps, each step echoing like regret, and process into the chapel to chant the night away. No one ever dared suggest shortening the office or skipping a psalm. That would have been heresy, or worse, lazy. And so they endured. They endured the stiff benches, the cold air that made their noses run in unison, the occasional unfortunate snore that disrupted the Gloria Patri. But even more than discomfort, they endured each other. Because in a third hour, without sunlight or conversation, each monk became just a set of breathing noises and shifting robes in the dark. You couldn't tell who was praying and who was dozing with their eyes closed and lips moving just enough to pass. You couldn't ask either. It wasn't the done thing. There was one winter, when the furnace broke, a particularly unholy February that seemed sent as penance for something they'd long forgotten. That month, Brother Timon took to wrapping his feet in cheesecloth before prayers, claiming it trapped heat better than wool. Brother Anselm disapproved, of course, muttering about tradition and dignity, but when his own toes began to crack like old parchment, he quietly adopted the practice too. On especially cold nights, someone no one admitted who would slip into the chapel early and place a brick, still warm from the hearth beneath the central lectern. The monks pretended not to notice, but each leaned slightly forward during readings, letting the warmth rise toward their chins like a shy blessing. Then, as Lent approached one year, the abbey received a new recruit, a man named Orwin, who was quiet, older than expected, and carried himself like someone used to not being noticed. He spoke little, kept his cell neat, and ask to be assigned to bell duty. No one argued. Bell duty meant being the first to rise, the one to wake the rest. It was not popular, but Orwin took it with silent enthusiasm. And from the very first week, something changed. The bell rang differently. Not louder, not softer, but with intention, as though each toll said, "Come, I am still here. You are not alone." And during the third hour, when the air still bit and the candles still flickered, the fear began to lift. Slowly, subtly. The monks stood straighter. They sang with fewer yawns. Even Brother Timon stopped twitching at the shadows behind the altar. No one said it aloud, but they knew. Orwin brought something with him, a steadiness, a calm, the sort of presence one only finds in those who have lived long enough to regret things thoroughly. And perhaps in the hush of that pre-dawn chapel, surrounded by half-frozen prayers and unfinished dreams, he found a place to rest. Not a home exactly, but a pause, a breath, something between sin and redemption. And beyond the abbey, beyond the candles and stone, the snow kept falling. Gently, consistently, covering fields, forests, and the thatched roofs of far-off villages where even older stories brewed. Because while the monks prayed and endured, a queen stirred from a restless sleep in a chamber too warm and too full of obligations. And her dreams were not of psalms, but of shame, a royal shame wrapped in silk and protocol from the cold stones of St. Mellitus, where Orwin's quiet bell began to untangle the drowsy fears of monks in their woolen prayers. Our path now bends toward softer ground, still firm, still shadowed, but padded by tapestries and thick rugs no peasant would dare imagine. We enter a royal chamber, not grand, not gilded, but very well kept. Its hearth glows too steadily to be comforting, and the scent of rosewater hangs in the air like something applied to cover up thinking. Here sleeps, or rather does not sleep, a queen. Her name is not important, or rather too well known to speak. Her face has been embroidered into ceremonial banners and painted beside husbands who never really looked at her. She has smiled through births, bowed through betrayals, and held court with a grace so perfect it has started to feel like stiffness. Tonight, though, she does not sleep. She lies on her back in a bed far too large, the covers drawn up with careful symmetry, her hands folded over her stomach, like someone awaiting burial or a very long sermon. Her eyes are open, tracking the shadows on the ceiling. Not ghosts, exactly, just memories dressed in silk. She remembers all too clearly the banquet that ended too late, and the laughter that came too easily, the Duke of Melberg's joke about pickled trout, the way she tilted her goblet before the toast, and the slipperiness of the marble floor near the musicians. She remembers the precise moment her stomach made that sound, not loud, but pointed, and how the bishop's cough wasn't quite quick enough to cover it. She had nodded demure, but a pulse had started in her temple that hadn't stopped since. It's always something. A stumble, a blot of ink on a thank you letter, a forgotten name. And because she is queen, each tiny mistake glows like a torch in the memory of others. But tonight, it isn't that dinner that keeps her awake. It's a memory older than her coronation, older than her title, older even than her first disappointment. It is the memory of her wedding night, not because it was dramatic or romantic or even strange, but because of one moment when she laughed. Not loudly, not rudely, just a breath caught in her throat and escaped sideways. Her husband, already half asleep beside her, blinked once and muttered, "Is something amusing?" She said no, but something was. Not him, not the night, not even herself. Just something. A slip of absurdity, a thought that didn't belong. And since then, she has not laughed like that again. She learned not to. Laughter for queens must be measured like perfume, just enough to seem pleasant, not enough to suggest opinion. Now on this restless night, she turns to her side, facing the velvet curtain that separates her bed from the rest of the room. Behind it is a table set for morning tea, already arranged by servants who know her habits better than she does. A small kettle, 3 slices of pear, and the biscuits she pretends not to enjoy. She sighs, not dramatically, just enough to notice the exhale. She wonders if the monks still keep vigil at St. Mellitus. She remembers being there once, years ago, cloaked and quiet, brought by her mother for some political reason, dressed up as a pilgrimage. She had sat through an early morning service, teeth chattering, too afraid to adjust her shawl. The monk who rang the bell had nodded at her on the way out. She never forgot that nod. It had been the only true acknowledgement she'd received all that day. The court had fawned, the scribes had bowed, but the monk had simply seen her. She shifts again now onto her back. A log pops in the hearth. She thinks about the court fool who had vanished last month. One morning, he simply didn't arrive to breakfast to reenact the chancellor's way of sneezing. No one mentioned it directly. Another had been brought in younger, louder, less clever. He tried too hard. The queen smiled, of course. She always smiled. But part of her wondered if the old fool had laughed at her once. Not cruelly, just privately, where no one else noticed. She would have liked that. She sits up, swings her legs over the side of the bed. The floor is warm, heated from below, as always. She pads softly to the writing desk, draws open a drawer, and takes out a small piece of folded paper. It's a letter, half-written, not yet sealed, not addressed, not signed. Just something she's been writing over and over in new drafts, never meant to be sent. A list of sorts, not grievances, not diary entries, just moments. Moments she remembers. The way the gardener's apprentice hummed when no one was nearby. The time she spilled ink on her own lap and blamed the dog. The creak of the chapel door at St. Mellitus. The exact scent of her mother's perfume, lavender, but not quite. She reads the list again, eyes scanning each line as though it were a map to a place she's trying to remember how to reach. She considers adding another line, but then she folds the paper and returns it to the drawer. Outside, the sky has begun to lighten, not with sunrise, but with that peculiar blue that comes just before. She stands by the window, not opening it, just resting a hand on the glass. It's cool, solid, honest, and down below somewhere in the sleeping gardens, she sees movement. Just a gardener, perhaps, or a servant checking the chicken coops, or a ghost of some past version of herself, walking barefoot on a dare. She stays there a long moment. Until the candles flicker. Until the tea begins to steam gently in the kettle. Until it is time once again to pretend. And far away in another kingdom, not so unlike hers, another queen lies still, but not from rest and not from shame. For her story was not one of unease or memory, but of collapse. A collapse so sudden that the entire court held its breath for days. And so we follow the fading hush from the sleepless queen's chamber down long corridors, lined with still portraits and echoing floor tiles, across quiet courtyards, where frost clings politely to marble fountains, and through the uncertain space between twilight and rumor. There, in another palace, much like hers, but touched with a colder draft and less careful servants, another queen lies, not in contemplation, but in stillness, an undisturbed, deeply inconvenient stillness. Her name had once been spoken with ceremony, embroidered into songs no one now remembers the endings of. Her rule was not legendary, but it was long enough that her shoes had worn deep patterns into the velvet runners of the great hall. This hall, in fact, where she now lies, exactly where she fell 2 days ago, mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought. It happened just as she was pointing toward the chandelier, something about the height being improper, or the candles not being the right sort of ivory, and then her knees simply refused to continue the conversation. Her hands fluttered like startled doves, her crown tilted with unexpected grace, and down she went. A small gasp escaped her lips, not from fear, but from surprise, as if the floor had interrupted her point, which, to be fair, it had. Courtiers had rushed forward, not quite running, not quite slow. A few noblewomen shrieked tastefully, of course, and someone sent a boy to fetch a physician. The queen's eyes, half-lidded and annoyed, blinked once. Then not again. The first physician to arrive was new. He poked gently at her wrist, frowned at her temples, and murmured something about imbalance. The second physician arrived, breathless, announced that the first was clearly undertrained, and poked in the same places with greater authority. The third physician never entered the room, but shouted his diagnosis from the hallway. Something about vapors or divine judgment. No one took notes. Meanwhile, the queen remained horizontal. She was not dead, though several people whispered that she might be. She was not awake, though her fingers occasionally twitched, as if testing the air for opinions. She simply remained. 2 days. That's how long she has lain there. They moved her once slightly, so her head wouldn't rest too awkwardly on the threshold between 2 rug panels. Someone tried to place a cushion beneath her elbow, but was swiftly advised against it by a footman who insisted on protocol. Food was brought, and then taken away. Curtains were drawn. Bells were not rung. A quiet sort of panic settled in. Because what do you do with a queen who does not wake, does not die, and does not explain? The courtiers began to speak of omens. Some cited a sparrow that had entered the library uninvited the week before. Others mentioned the dog barking at the statue of her father that morning. Even the steward, who had never uttered a poetic phrase in his life, remarked that the air felt thoughtful. Her son, a lanky young man with a fondness for astronomy and absolutely no interest in governing, sat beside her for exactly 3 hours before declaring that he needed to consult the stars. He was last seen in the observatory, trying to align a telescope with a comet that had already passed. Her daughter, much more practical, suggested checking for signs of poison. The royal cook took offense. For a while, a group of lesser nobles debated whether the throne could technically be warmed in her absence, just to keep things moving. But no one dared sit in it. Her crown had been carefully removed and placed on a small silk pillow at the edge of the hall. It remained there, untouched, like a very decorative misunderstanding. The queen's maidservant, the only one permitted to speak, plainly noted that the queen had not slept well for weeks. Something about whispers in the corridor and the weight of too many small decisions. She said the queen had recently asked for a smaller spoon at dinner, not because she disliked the large ones, but because they made the soup feel farther away. No one knew what to make of that. So they waited. Servants dusted around her. Musicians tuned quietly in an adjacent room, in case she rose and demanded melody. The fireplace was stoked, though no one sat near it. A blanket was folded nearby, but not used, and the queen, noble and unmoved, remained as she was caught between action and memory. Some say her mind had simply retreated, like a tide pulled too far by obligations. Others believed she had seen something no one else could see, and was still trying to process it. A message in the light. A shape in the dust. A feeling in the bones. Whatever it was, she did not share it. She had, after all, always been careful with her words. And now, as the third day dawned, and the windows began to glow with an unbothered sort of light, the hall remained unchanged. The courtiers spoke in quieter tones. The tapestries fluttered, as if to remind everyone that time still moved, even if the queen did not. And just as a page leaned in to suggest that perhaps she should be moved properly, maybe to a bed or a quieter room, her fingers twitched once more. Not a grand motion, not enough to inspire a proclamation, but enough for the maidservant to say, "She's listening." And far away, in another part of the kingdom, in a village where no one would ever dream of collapsing mid-sentence beneath a chandelier, a group of children gathered in the dusty schoolhouse to hear a lesson about kings' stars and the importance of good posture. Among them sat a boy who would one day stumble into a crown without meaning to, and a girl who would one day be remembered, not for ruling, but for remembering things no one else bothered to write down. From the velvet stillness of the royal hall, where a queen's fingers whispered their first answer in days, we step now into simpler air, thinner walls, and colder benches, a place where no crowns gleamed, but imagination wandered with soft shoes. The village schoolhouse stood at the edge of a muddy lane, wedged between the chapel garden and the cooper's shed, its roof perpetually in negotiation with the wind. The windows were streaked from a combination of weather and children's breath, and the door creaked with a kind of prolonged complaint that suggested both age and disapproval. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chalk wool and unwashed ambition. This was not a prestigious school. There were no uniforms, no music lessons, and no crests embroidered onto anyone's collar. But each morning, a dozen or so children trundled in, clutching slates, squinting with sleep, and hoping quietly that the fire had already been lit. At the front of the room stood Master Leoric, a man whose beard seemed older than his knees, and whose voice traveled at one volume polite monotony. He taught letters, numbers, and the kind of history that had been trimmed of drama and steeped in footnotes. He disliked exaggeration. He mistrusted heroes. His chalkboard diagrams of castles looked suspiciously like potatoes with flags. But he had a talent, unintentional perhaps, for pausing at just the right moments. And it was during one such pause that the story of a long-ago queen surfaced not as a lesson, but as an example of poor decision-making under pressure. She once demanded that every tower be built with a window facing east, he said, tapping the chalk with precision, because she believed the sunrise made her profile more symmetrical. Naturally, the western towers collapsed first. Never trust architecture guided by vanity. Most of the children looked bored, except two. One was a boy named Ruin, whose shoes were always damp, and whose father brewed vinegar for a living. He sat near the stove and doodled shields on his slate, not because he admired knights, but because the curves were satisfying. The other was a girl named Edla, who never drew and never blinked during stories. She was the kind of child who asked questions teachers didn't enjoy answering. "What happened to the queen?" she asked, not loudly, but with the seriousness of someone checking a ledger. Master Leoric paused, blinked twice, and gave a non-committal shrug. "She died. All queens do." "But how?" Edla asked again. "Did she fall? Was it the western tower? Irrelevant," he muttered. "The point is symmetry." Ruin smirked into his sleeve. Edla didn't. She scribbled a note on the corner of her slate, a habit she'd picked up, despite being told that side notes were disorderly. The truth was, she'd been keeping a personal record of every unfinished story Master Leoric told. Her slate was filled with half-names, questions, and events that didn't seem quite done. Ruin, who had noticed, called it her history of interruptions. He didn't mock her for it. In fact, he began to remember things better because of her questions. The schoolhouse's only book, a thick volume bound in peeling leather, sat on a shelf too high for most to reach. It contained maps with outdated borders, a timeline that skipped entire centuries, and illustrations where every monarch looked vaguely disappointed. On rainy days, Master Leoric allowed 2 students to read from it under supervision. Edla always volunteered. Ruin occasionally joined her, not because he liked the book, but because she made margins interesting. On one such afternoon, as sleet pelted the shutters, and the others practiced reciting multiplication tables. In wobbly unison, Edla pointed to a faded paragraph. "Look," she whispered, "it mentions a queen who collapsed in a hall. It just says mysterious affliction." Ruin leaned in. "Maybe she was asleep," he said, like your cat when it doesn't want to get up. Or maybe Edla said she was listening to something no one else could hear. They didn't laugh. They just sat there, rereading the line, as if it might finish itself. Master Leoric shuffled over, peered down at the page, and cleared his throat. "That story is unfinished," he admitted, which was the closest he'd come to confession all term. The chronicler died before completing the account. "There are rumors, of course, but we don't entertain rumors here." "Why not?" asked Edla. "Because they encourage imagination," he said, "and imagination leads to confusion." Ruin raised an eyebrow. "I think I'm already confused." That evening, Edla didn't go straight home. She stopped by the chapel, where the parish clerk sometimes let her borrow scraps of parchment, too brittle for proper records. She copied the passage about the queen carefully and tucked it into a pocket, sewn secretly into her skirt. That night, by candlelight, she began to add her own notes. Not facts, not fantasies, just quiet thoughts about why a queen might fall and not wake, and what sort of world might surround a silence like that. Across the village, Ruin sat at his family's hearth, carving symbols into a bit of leftover wood. He wasn't sure why. They weren't runes, not really, just marks he'd seen in the margins of Edla's slate. Something about them made sense, even if they didn't explain anything. And beyond the village, far from firelight and slates, in the heart of a distant city where scrolls were hoarded and silence was sacred. A scholar traced a name across a crumbling page, Edla's name, written in the hand of someone not yet born. From the small schoolhouse where Edla scribbled histories, too quiet for the main book, and Ruin carved symbols no one had taught him, we now shift through time like pages turned by a hesitant hand, and find ourselves in a city too gray to be unfashionable and too old to remember why it was founded. Here, in a quarter, no longer fashionable, but still suspiciously expensive, sits an archive wrapped in dust and smugness. Its ceilings are high, not out of grandeur, but because the builders miscalculated the ratio of parchment to air. The archive smells of ink, candle smoke, and mild condescension. It houses scrolls. No one has read books that intimidate their own shelves, and a staff of scholars who have slowly forgotten how to explain things simply. Among them works Master Oakland, who once had a first name, but has since misplaced it somewhere between a dissertation on spindle taxes and a monograph about the geography of royal size. He walks with the posture of someone who reads while moving and wears spectacles. not because he needs them, but because they discourage small talk. Auckland is a specialist in unnoticed history, minor events, irrelevant parliament's treaties that never took effect, and the lives of people who were never expected to be remembered. He is fond of footnotes and distrusts anecdotes. He eats lentils with consistency. One morning, while researching a dispute about medieval window tax exemptions, he unrolled a scroll mislabeled as miscellaneous family accounts. What he found instead was a list of names, some crossed out, some circled none famous. But near the bottom, in a faded hand that had tried too hard to be formal, was written the name Edla Child of Frostkeeper of Fragments. Auckland blinked. He stared. He adjusted his spectacles. This was irregular. No date, no surname, just that strange phrase, Keeper of Fragments. He copied it into his notes, then spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the name Edla in birth ledgers, taxation logs, and 2 volumes of notable minorities in forgotten villages. Nothing. He did find a brief mention of a schoolmaster named Leoric, known for excessive caution and drawing castles shaped like produce, but no student list survived. That evening, instead of walking home by his usual path, Auckland detoured through the garden where the archivists grew medicinal herbs and rare ink plants. He sat on a bench that creaked like old parchment and stared at the copy of Edla's name, Child of Frost. What did that mean? A seasonal reference, a poetic flourish, a misinterpretation of a nickname. He stayed until the garden lights flickered on, illuminating the basil like startled guests. The next day he returned to the scroll. It had been moved. Not lost. Nothing was ever lost at the archive, just perpetually in transition. He filed a request. 3 days later, it was returned to him inside a sleeve marked irrelevant. He bristled, but he read it again. This time, he noticed a smudge near the bottom. Faint round, shaped like a thumbprint, made by someone with cold fingers. He smiled, not because he understood it, but because it felt, like a clue. Over the following weeks, Auckland began to see Edla everywhere. In old reports of village children who asked too many questions. In anonymous essays that challenged the usefulness of symmetry in royal portraits. In margin notes that resembled her handwriting. He even found a footnote referencing an Edla who refused to learn the alphabet in order preferring to organize letters by sound and color. He wrote a paper about her. It was rejected. Speculative, the reviewers wrote. Over-attached to a single figure. Auckland grumbled. Then he wrote another paper. This one about the influence of forgotten children on the tonal shifts in minor chronicles. It too was rejected, but a librarian quietly told him it had been read by someone very senior. Encouraged, he began a private project compiling everything he could find about people like Edla. Not heroes, not villains, just those who had noticed things. Children, servants, scribes, and others who had slipped between the lines of history like spilled ink. He called the collection The Fragmented Witness. In a binder too worn for its age, he added her name again, this time in bold, this time without apology. One evening, while rearranging his notes, he found a small slip of parchment wedged in the folds of a ledger. It was not in his handwriting. It was very old. It read ruin, carved truth into wood. Edla wrote what was not yet true. Auckland exhaled slowly. He copied the note. Then he burned the original. Not out of destruction, but preservation. Some things, after all, were not meant to be stored. That night, as he closed the archive door and stepped into the lamp-lit street, he noticed the sky had a faint pink hue. Not sunrise, not sunset. Just something in between. He walked home, slowly, as though carrying a thought too precious to rush. And far away, in a part of the kingdom where no archives stood, and children's names were recorded only when they misbehaved, a woodcarver's apprentice sat, sharpening a chisel, under the creaking branches of an old oak tree. His name was not yet Ruin, and he had not yet met Edla, but the wind stirred like a page being turned. From the dust-blanketed halls of the archive, where Master Oakland whispered Edla's name like a forgotten spell, and the scent of old parchment clung to his sleeves, we now move far beyond shelves and footnotes to a quieter part of the world where the only pages turned are leaves in the wind, and the stories are told more often with hands than voices. It is here, beneath the old oak that leans slightly to the left, as if eavesdropping on its own roots, that a boy sharpens a chisel with slow, deliberate strokes. His name is not yet Ruin, though it will be. For now, he is simply called the apprentice, and most people don't bother to add more than that. The master woodcarver, an elderly man named Baedric, who once carved the lectern for the abbey at St. Mellitus, and claimed the grain in cedar was more honest than royalty, refers to him only when necessary, usually with a grunt and a nod in the direction of the next task. They live in a cottage that is technically part of the village, though it sits far enough up the slope that people hesitate to visit, unless they have a specific need for a spindle, a spoon, or a statue. The boy doesn't mind the solitude. He prefers the company of curls of shaven wood and the rhythm of blade against bark. He speaks rarely, not from shyness, but from a quiet conviction that most things worth saying can be said better by carving. His days begin early with the hiss of the kettle and Baedric's slow footsteps over floorboards that complain like old men. Breakfast is bread, unless the bread has gone, in which case it is apology, tea, hot water, with a leaf of something floral, and very little pretense. Then come the tools, whetstones, brushes, chisels, arranged by length and stubbornness. The boy sharpens them all, even the ones Baedric hasn't touched in years. He believes that someday they will be needed, and in the late mornings, when the sun hits the oak just so, and the bees hum with bureaucratic focus around the lavender patch, the real work begins. They carve everything: doors, bowls, a chess set where the knights look vaguely like donkeys and the pawns wear confused expressions. But lately, the boy has started carving shapes Baedric did not assign. Small symbols, lines and curves that don't match any known pattern. He hides them on the undersides of shelves, on the backs of stools, inside the hollow of a wooden apple. Baedric knows, of course. He says nothing. Instead, he watches the boy the way someone watches the wind when it changes direction warily, but without panic. One afternoon, while working on a commission for a merchant who insisted his garden needed a statue of St. Perius, holding a pear, the boy carved the fruit too small. "No one will believe he's a saint of abundance," Baedric muttered, frowning at the dainty pear. The boy shrugged. "Maybe it's not about the fruit," he said, and it was the first full sentence he'd spoken that week. Baedric grunted, which meant both disagreement and approval. That night, the boy stayed up, long after the candle should have burned out, sketching shapes into the soot-dusted windowpane. He didn't know where they came from. They simply felt necessary, like knots in a rope you don't remember tying. One of the shapes resembled the marks Edla had once drawn on her slate, the same ones Oakland had noticed in his archive, though the boy did not know her name, and she had not yet spoken his. But something pulsed quietly through time, as if their memories had found a way to braid together across distance and forgetting. The next day, a stranger came to the cottage, a traveler with a heavy cloak, and an accent made from too many places. He carried a cane, not for injury, but because he liked the weight of it. He asked if the carver might make him a walking stick with stories in it. Stories, Baedric said, raising one eyebrow higher than any man his age should. Not scenes. Stories, the traveler said. I want people to wonder what it means when they see it. Baedric gestured to the boy. He's the one you want? He makes things people don't understand. The traveler looked at the apprentice. Good, he said. Understanding is overrated. So the boy carved the cane, slowly, carefully. He did not plan it. He let his hands follow the shapes that came without permission. Swirls that looked like rivers and lines that bent like questions, and in one spot near the top, the outline of a queen's face, not because he knew her, but because she had been carved into the corner of his thoughts since the day he dreamed of marble and silence. When he finished, the traveler took the cane in both hands, turned it over, nodded once, and left without paying. Baedric didn't mind. Sometimes the world pays in its own way, he muttered. That night, the boy dreamt of a library, not a place he'd seen, but one filled with tall ceilings and scrolls that whispered names when touched. He saw a man with spectacles scribbling in a corner. He saw a girl folding parchment into pockets no one else could find. And when he woke, he carved the dream into the underside of his workbench because writing felt too loud, and carving made the memory quiet enough to keep. And not far from the cottage, past the bend in the stream where fish leapt only when no one was watching, a traveling performer arrived in a town square, juggling torches and truths, spinning tales of court jesters and forgotten kings. She wore bells that did not match, and spoke in verses that made children lean forward and elders lean back. Her story tonight would begin with a blade that remembered too much. From the wood shavings beneath the apprentice's bench, where carved dreams waited for someone to notice them, we wander now into a town square brushed with dust and old music. The stones are warm from sunlight that forgot to check the season, and the air smells faintly of turnips and boiled cinnamon. At the center of the square, surrounded by modest stalls selling ribbons, onions, and questions about the weather, stands a woman in boots too scuffed to be new, and a coat stitched from pieces of stories. She is not tall, not short, and not easily described, except to say that when she speaks, people listen, not because her voice is loud, but because it tilts slightly, as though words were pebbles skipping across a calm lake. She is a performer, not of tricks, though she juggles, not of music, though she hums. She tells stories, stories that don't end where they should, and sometimes don't begin where you expect. Her name changes in each village, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because no one thinks to ask. Today, she is called Vera. She wears bells that do not match, one from a donkey harness, one from a cat's collar, one from the wrist of a court jester, long since gone. They jingle when she moves, not rhythmically, but conversationally, like punctuation for someone who never learned to write properly. Children gather first, as they always do, drawn by the promise of nonsense. Then come the grown-ups pretending to browse the candied beets or the suspicious pottery while inching closer. A dog lies at her feet, ears twitching at keywords. Vera lifts a crooked stick, part cane part, wand part weathered prop, and draws a circle in the air. Today, she says, we begin with a blade. Not sharp, not rusty, just a blade that remembers too much. It once belonged to a cook who never became famous, and then to a knight who never became wise. She pauses. The square stills. Even the baker stops kneading. But the blade, she continues, had been carved, not engraved, carved. Tiny symbols along the hilt, a girl's name, a place where silence lived, and something that looked like a question, trying to be a bird. A man in the back murmurs, "That's not how stories start." Vera smiles, not at him, but at the air beside him. "That's exactly how this one starts," she replies. Her tail winds and wobbles. It includes a jester who lost his laugh during a royal feast, a monk who confused salt with ashes, and a queen who once slept for 7 years and woke asking about soup. It is absurd. It is beautiful. It is somehow true, at least true enough to feel real. As she speaks, she reaches into her coat and pulls out objects with no ceremony, a spoon carved with vines, a thimble that hums when near fire, a folded parchment labeled unsent. She does not explain them. She simply lets them sit there, like memories not yet unpacked. The children lean closer. A girl with uneven braids mouths the names as Vera says them, as if trying to catch them for later. A boy with too many freckles stares at the spoon, as though it might stir something all on its own. And in the crowd stands a man who has heard the story before. Not all of it, not exactly, but enough. His name is Orwin now. He still carries, the satchel still wears the quiet around his shoulders. He had not meant to stop in this town. He had not meant to listen. But when she spoke of the queen who collapsed and did not fall, he remembered the weight of bells. Vera, without glancing at him, shifts her story. She speaks now of an apprentice who carved in silence, who dreamed of shapes before he knew their meaning. She says he carved a cane once with a river that bent like regret, and a face at the top that no one could forget. Orwin blinks. The crowd does not notice. Vera meets his eyes, just for a second. She does not nod. She does not smile, but the jingle of her bells softens, and then, as the story reaches its midpoint, not its end, because her tales never truly end, she bows, not deeply, but exactly far enough. Coins clink into her open palm, some with generosity, some with obligation. The children scatter. The dog stretches. The townspeople return to their turnips. Vera packs her things slowly, carefully, as she folds the parchment labeled unsent. Orwin steps forward. "You forgot something," he says. She looks at the paper, then at him. "Did I? That part?" he says about the monk who confused salt with ashes. "You left it unfinished." "Good," she says, tucking the parchment into her coat. "Unfinished things have better memory." He nods. She turns to go. The dog follows. And just as she reaches the edge of the square, she says, "Not turning. She's looking for you, you know." Who Orwin asks, though he already knows. The one who writes what hasn't happened yet. And with that, she vanishes into the alley between the cooper's shed and the old bathhouse, leaving behind only the sound of mismatched bells and a scent of something almost familiar. And in a quiet town far to the west, where windows stick and chalk breaks in predictable patterns, a girl sits at a desk too small for her thoughts, copying a new name into her list of unfinished things. From the cracked stones of a sun-warmed square where Vera's bells faded, like punctuation in the wind. And Orwin stood among turnips, and memory, we now drift westward once more to the village where Edla, not quite a child, and not yet a legend, sat hunched over her slate with a piece of charcoal that had worn itself into an uneven angle. The schoolroom had long emptied its benches, now ghosted with the outlines of inattentive backsides, But Edla remained just as she often did, chewing the edge of her lip and copying notes into her book of unfinished things. It was not a proper book. It had started as a ledger, discarded by the chapel clerk, its first 10 pages filled with numbers and complaints about stolen hymnals, but Edla had claimed it carefully, drawing lines through what didn't matter, and layering her own handwriting on top, like a palimpsest of curiosity. She wrote names, not always full ones, and events half-told queens who fell mid-sentence jesters, who vanished between performances, monks who stood still too long, apprentices who carved their dreams into apple cores. Some entries were just questions. Can a blade remember? What if laughter is a language? Why does no one teach the history of whispers? She didn't know who would read it, but she believed someone would. Maybe a librarian in a future so far away the ink hadn't yet dried. Maybe no one. Maybe herself, older, with more understanding and worse handwriting. Outside dusk began to gather, with the indecision of someone waiting to be invited. Edla shut the book and tucked it into the pouch she kept under her skirt flap, the one stitched with threads pulled from a curtain that once hung in her grandmother's tea room. She rose, stretched, and walked not home, but toward the edge of town, where the old road tilted slightly southward toward fields left fallow, and stories that had yet to plant themselves. She walked without shoes, not from poverty, she had shoes, but because she liked how the ground changed its mind with each step. Gravel moss, dry soil, something squishy. At the edge of the orchard near a tree that leaned as if bored, she paused. There, wedged between 2 roots, was a stick. Not a particularly notable stick, but it had been carved, not with care, not with decoration, just enough to say, I was noticed. Edla picked it up. On one side, a shape, on the other, a line that curled like hesitation. She did not smile, but her fingers tightened around it slightly, and she turned toward the slope that led down to the river path, where a market sometimes formed on weekends, and an old woman with a yellow shawl told fortunes using stale candy. Edla passed the shawl woman without greeting, not rudely, just in the manner of someone too occupied with arrival to bother with introductions. At the river's bend, where the stones made a sound like muffled applause, she sat. She opened her book. She placed the carved stick beside it. She did not write. Not at first. Instead, she stared at the water, which moved like someone thinking. And then, slowly, she tore out one page, the one with the queen who collapsed, and the scholar who noticed, and folded it into a boat. She had never done that before. Her folds were crooked. The paper protested, but it held. She set it gently into the water. It drifted. Not far, but it didn't sink, and that was enough. She folded another, and another. By the time the moon had replaced the sun with polite efficiency, the river carried a dozen misshapen boats, each carrying a different fragment. Somewhere downstream, a fisherman would find one and mutter about children wasting paper. Somewhere else, a librarian would wake in the night, certain a name had just whispered through the dust. And Edla, watching the boats vanish into ripple and fog, felt something loosen behind her ribs, not like forgetting, but like permission. She stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and walked back toward the village with the slow certainty of someone whose questions had started to become directions. As she passed the chapel, a candle flickered behind the stained glass. As she passed the bakery, the cat on the windowsill sneezed. As she reached her door, she paused. The handle felt colder than usual. Inside, the fire had been lit, but no one had been home. On the table was a scroll, tied not with ribbon, but with string made from nettle thread. She recognized the knot. It was the same one she tied when she didn't want something to be opened too quickly. She stared, then opened it. Inside, no words, just symbols. Curved like the ones she'd seen in her dreams. Angular like the ones she'd scratched on the barn wall that morning and then brushed away. One symbol repeated. A circle with a tail. She whispered Orwin. Not loudly, just enough for the room to remember. She added a new page to her book, not in ink, in thread. And far away, on a path worn thin by years and reluctance, Orwin walked with his satchel, lighter than he remembered a carved cane, tapping gently beside him. And a direction forming not from orders, but from echoes, from the room where Edla stood, with thread in her fingers and a scroll on her table, one that carried no words, yet weighed down the air like something that had waited too long. We drift again, not far in space, but wide in meaning, to a winding path bordered by hedges that had not been trimmed properly since the last local mayor attempted to legislate symmetry. The path was old, though no one remembered when it first appeared. It wove gently between villages past orchards and empty wells, always at a slight incline, no matter which direction you walked. On this path walked Orwin, one hand on his carved cane, the other adjusting the strap of a satchel whose contents had slowly dwindled over the years, until now it contained only 3 items: a folded map. He had never used a polished stone with a hole through the middle, and a slip of paper that read, "In case you forget who you were trying not to be." The cane, of course, was the 4th item, though Orwin no longer thought of it as an object exactly. It was more of a quiet companion, full of symbols and weight. He had not meant to walk this far. His original plan, if one could call it that, had been to visit a monastery near the coast where people wrote prayers in ink made from seaweed. But each time he tried to move west, the wind pulled south. He no longer fought it. The path felt right, not comfortable, not convenient, but right, like a shoe that pinched in just the spot that reminded you it was your own. Ahead, the hedges thinned, and he could see a fork in a path marked by a stone post with no inscription. Just a carving, a circle, with a tail. He tapped his cane once against it, and smiled. Not broadly, just enough to crease the corner of his cheek, where an old scar refused to be subtle. The left fork led down into a grove where the trees leaned toward one another like gossip. The right path climbed toward a ridge where a low wall of stacked stones had once marked the border of a kingdom that never got around to existing. He chose neither. He stepped off the path entirely. Not far, just enough to feel the ground shift beneath him into something slightly less certain. The air changed, not dramatically, just in temperature and intent. And there, among the moss-covered stones, sat a girl. Not a girl, perhaps. Not anymore. She sat cross-legged, with her book of unfinished things open across her lap, and a stick in her hand, drawing shapes in the soil that did not stay drawn. Edla did not look up. "You're late," she said, brushing away the symbol and starting another. Orwin sat beside her, slowly, knees protesting, like furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. "I took the long way," he replied, setting his cane across his knees. "It's the only way I remember." She handed him the stick. "Your turn." He hesitated, then carved a line, then another. A loop. A mark. Edla nodded, then reached into her pouch and withdrew a folded page, one of the riverboats dried now and softened by water's memory. She opened it gently, revealing a name neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. He took it. He read it. He did not need to ask. The wind shifted again. Behind them, the path continued, not backward, not forward, but outward, as though making room. They sat in silence for some time. Not the awkward kind, the kind that builds structures without walls. She's still out there, Edla said at last, not pointing, not naming. The Queen Orwen asked. Yes, and the monk, and the fool, and the boy who carved before he knew how, and the girl who wrote things that weren't true yet. She glanced at him. She's trying to be braver now. Good, he said. We'll need that. They stood not quickly, but with purpose. Orwen picked up his cane. Edla tucked the boat back into her pouch. Together, they stepped back onto the path, which had straightened itself slightly in their absence, as though clearing its throat. Ahead, a figure approached. Bells tinkled, not musically, but rhythmically, like someone remembering the exact timing of a forgotten entrance. It was Vera, of course, or someone very like her. She did not wave. She simply turned and joined them, falling into step with the ease of someone who had already told this story at least once. There's a gathering, she said, in the hollow where the trees sing, only when no one listens. They're waiting. Who's waiting? Edla asked. The ones who never got to finish, and the ones who never got to start. What do they need from us? Orwen asked. Vera grinned, and her bells laughed softly in reply. Just to be there. Just to remember without insisting. It makes sense. And so they walked, the three of them, under branches that leaned closer, and skies that held their breath. Behind them, the path remained. Ahead, it opened. From the moment the path adjusted its course, as if remembering who it was built for Orwen, Edla, and Vera walked without speaking further, not from lack of things to say, but because silence had begun to feel like the proper language for where they were going. The trees grew taller here, not grand or intimidating, just tall enough to forget their tops, and the ground beneath their feet shifted from the confident firmness of worn trail to something gentler, as though even the earth had decided not to intrude. The air held the cool dampness of stone caves, and laundry hung too long indoors. Then, without fanfare, without even a proper clearing, they arrived at the hollow. It was neither large nor small. It had no name, and if it ever had one, the trees had politely let it go. But the circle was there. Not drawn, not fenced, formed. Stones smoothed by time or hands arranged loosely but intentionally, like the remains of a meeting no one was sure had happened. In the center, a fire, not burning, not lit, but warm, as though it had chosen to glow without flame. Around the circle sat others. Not many. Just enough to suggest a beginning, or perhaps a reluctant ending. A woman whose sleeves were embroidered with maps of towns that never appeared. A child with 3 pencils and no paper. A man who carried an umbrella even when indoors, though there were no doors here. A figure with a mask that changed its shape every time you blinked. Each held something: a scroll, a spoon, a small bell, a folded piece of sky. They looked up as the 3 arrived, not startled, not curious, welcoming in the way of those who already suspected you were coming. Edla stepped forward first, placing her book of unfinished things on one of the stones. Not ceremoniously, just carefully. I brought questions, she said. The woman with the map sleeves nodded. We've got a shortage of those. Orwen placed his cane beside the fire. It remembers things I didn't mean to forget. The child leaned forward. That's the best kind of remembering. Vera unbuttoned her coat and let it fall, revealing a tunic stitched with symbols, too old to be recent and too new to be ancient. She sat cross-legged near the edge, exactly in the place where the wind shifted slightly inward. We tell, she said. We don't explain. And so they began. Not with a speech or a plan. One by one they spoke, not loudly. Some didn't speak at all, just opened their palms to reveal what they carried, or blinked slowly in the direction of someone who understood. Edla read from the book, not the finished parts, but the ones she hadn't dared to read aloud before. A list of names she'd only guessed at. A sentence she once overheard, and never forgot. She laughed too early, and they never forgave her. Orwin added the story of the queen who didn't fall, not as an ending, but as a rhythm, suggesting maybe the collapse was just a pause, misinterpreted by the impatient. Vera told a tale she insisted she didn't invent about a jester who once lost his hat in a thunderstorm and found it again, years later, hanging from the bell tower of a monastery where no one had spoken for a century. They listened. They murmured. They nodded in the way that says, I didn't know that part, and also, I was waiting for you to say that. The fire glowed a little warmer. Someone poured tea that didn't come from anywhere. The air shimmered like parchment just before it's written on. Then a woman stepped forward, older than any of them, perhaps older than the circle itself. She wore a cloak of moth holes and starlight. Her hands shook not with fear, but with memory too full. She held a scroll, unmarked. She handed it to Edla. You finish it, she said, even if it doesn't end. Edla took it. The scroll was soft, warm, slightly humming. I don't know how she said. The old woman smiled, then vanished the way forgotten chores disappear, not with magic, just with enough time. And so Edla sat, opened the scroll, uncapped her pen, and began not to write, but to listen. The pen moved. Lines formed, some curved, some stuttered. Orwin sat beside her, not watching the scroll, just humming very softly the tune the court bells once played when no one else was awake. Vera adjusted her mask. It was hers now, clearly, and tilted her head toward the trees. They're coming, she whispered. Who, Orwin asked, the ones who remember differently. Edla nodded. Good. We need that too. Around the circle, the fire glowed, the tea poured, the names murmured, and somewhere beyond the edge of the hollow, not far and not near a bell tower, waited for someone to ask the right question at exactly the wrong time.